Welcome to the crowd computing section on getting crowd. This lecture will be the first of four main sections which talk about basic crowd computing techniques, um, techniques for getting a crowd, techniques for quality control when you have a crowd, techniques for using a crowd for ideation, and techniques for filtering the ideas created by a crowd. Okay, so to kind of summarize, um, maybe like the main lesson in terms of getting a crowd in crowd computing is that there is now a vast amount of cognitive horsepower available to us because of the internet, because we can reach billions of people basically for free with ubiquitous telecommunications. Um, we've Many applications have shown that we can get big results by getting tiny contributions from individual people, but doing that in abundance. Um, we found that many people, millions of people, are happy to work, as crowd workers, as volunteers for free, motivated by non-monetary incentives such as meaning, fun, and so on. And some of the biggest, I would say actually, um, all of the big platform companies have taken advantage of this crowd power in order to make billions of dollars in profits. So that's kind of the overview. Just to go into more detail, in terms of the amount of horsepower out there, about 5.5 billion people in the world, roughly 2/3 of the world population, have internet access, and it continues to grow. Uh, and the people on the internet have a vast amount of what we could call cognitive surplus, which means time to contribute to some crowd computing task. And just to give like one silly, simple example, Clay Shirky in 2009 pointed out that U.S. viewers spent about 100 million hours every weekend watching commercials. And that represented the amount of time that was needed to create Wikipedia at that point. So if US viewers alone, instead of watching commercials, would, write encyclopedia articles, you could have a new Wikipedia in one weekend. And that's just, for the United States. So the question that this section will address is, why would people contribute as crowd workers? What is it, that draws them in? How do we get them for the tasks we want to do? So let's consider first the example of Innocentive, which is, as I discussed earlier, a system where companies will, excuse me, describe engineering problems that they have and offer a bounty, usually in the thousands of dollars, for solving that engineering problem. And if you look at the prize amounts, it seems clear that the amount of money they're offering as a bounty is far, far less than the economic impact to them of having the problem solved. Because, these were problems that the company generally was unable to solve inside, and they, had a lot of expensive people probably working on it. They wouldn't have gone to the trouble of putting it on a website if it wasn't, important and impactful for them. Another interesting example of how you can get people involved, also contest, is the X Prize contest, which was set up by Peter Diamandis, a medical doctor, I guess almost a couple of decades ago. And using like a trick with Lloyd's Insurance Company, he set up a $10 million contest for the first private company to achieve spaceflight. And this prize money attracted 26 teams who are estimated to have collectively invested over $100 million in research and development. And so Peter Diamandis, he actually didn't invest $1 million. He actually invented just enough to buy an insurance policy for $10 million and was able to generate over $100 million of investment by people around the world. And this was essentially the creation of the commercial aerospace, the commercial space industry. For example, the winning team went on to form the foundation of Virgin Galactic, a space company, and in general, it ignited the era of commercial space flight. Another example is the Netflix Prize. Netflix wanted help with making their movie recommendation algorithm more accurate, and so they launched a prize asking people to improve it by the accuracy by 10%. And to do that, they publicized 100 million entries from its rating database. And so this happened on October 2nd. Now, by October 8th, 1 week later, a group had beat Cinematch, and Cinematch was something that, obviously Netflix had spent an enormous amount of money on because that was a huge part of, what distinguished them as, a video provider. A week after that, 3 teams had beaten Cinematch. So in 2 weeks already, by June, so that's, I guess about 6 months later, over 20,000 teams, 150 countries had registered. By November, over 30,000 contestants had submitted more than 20,000 solutions, leading to improvement of 8.4%. And finally, in November of 2008, after receiving 44,000 ballot submissions, somebody beat the 10% target and was awarded the grand prize of $1 million. And just to give you one more example, there's a coding company called Topcoder, where companies will take their coding problems, break them down into small bits, and then post them on the Topcoder platform and offer a prize for doing the best job at that particular subtask. And and then the winner is actually the top 2 teams will receive some kind of compensation. This model has been very successful in terms of providing high quality and low cost coding, with over at time of writing 300,000 programmers as part of the community, the Topcoder community. And each contest will generally have many teams participating. Like, you can just see on the slide that 85 people participate in the topmost contest. But as I mentioned before, only the top 2 teams only get any money for it. All the rest get nothing for all their effort. So the question is, why have these contests been so powerful and cost effective? You got to ask yourself, how much would it have cost Netflix to engage 30,000 scientists in 186 countries to try 44,000 solutions? It would have been a huge amount of money, far more than the $1 million prize they put out. And you also got to ask, why do top coders compete knowing that only the top 2 teams will get any money at all? So there's probably many possibilities for it, but one thing that seems to be a strong motivation in contests is basically overconfidence. Many people think they could win, even though their chances realistically are relatively low, and they will invest heavily. Also, there's probably, driven to some extent by competitiveness, maybe by excitement about the problem. Another kind of motivation puzzle comes up with Amazon Mechanical Turk, where companies advertise, again, tasks on a website, only these are tiny tasks for which people are paid tiny amounts of money, a few cents sometimes. If you look, in fact, at the distribution of pay amounts, that over 90% roughly 90% of the tasks are 10 cents or less, and basically 100% of them are $1 or less. And despite these low remuneration amounts, Mechanical Turk has, last time I checked, about 250,000 workers in 190 countries who are participating. Why do people work so actively on these micro tasks that pay so little? And there seem to be several motivations. One is that it's a very convenient kind of job. You can earn some money even if you only have a few minutes free, which has made it attractive, for example, to students, work-at-home moms, and so on. It's psychologically addictive because, it's been found that people, react to, getting multiple reinforcements, quick reinforcements, rather than having to wait for them, even if they're small. And also, of course, many of the countries where the click workers come from are countries that have lower pay scales, so even what counts as small payments by U.S. standards would be significant there. So it's essentially the impact of being able to reach a global market very cheaply and easily. Let's move on to another puzzle. If open source software has been an incredible success in some ways, the #1 server software, the #1 and 2 web browser, WebKits, the #2 operating system software are all open source, which means that they were generated, for free by legions of volunteers. Another example in the software realm is Stack Overflow, where millions of people submit programming questions, and then others will provide answers to those questions. And in addition, people will be rating the questions for importance as well as rating the answers for accuracy and completeness. And this has been hugely successful globally, mostly replacing programming manuals, since it is responsive, incredibly comprehensive, keeps growing over time. At the time of I checked on data, there were 51 billion instances of knowledge reuse through this, collectively created, volunteer-based programming resource. So the question you could ask yourself is, why do people engage in such huge software projects and/or answer questions at such scale for free? So we're not even talking micropayments anymore. And there seem to be several motivations involved in these kinds of crowd computing. One is that software developers are fed up with expensive, buggy, slow to evolve commercial software, so they want to build the software that they want to use. And, if they have a way to form as a community around that, then they can actually get it done with a reasonable investment by each individual developer. Second is participating in open source is a great way to learn about technology by participating in a community effort to build it. And finally, people can get awesome credentials by participating in open source if they contributed enough to what are considered to be important applications. So, just to give an example, the top contributor in Stack Overflow, last time I checked, was Gordon Linhoff, who had contributed, wow, that's amazing, nearly 23,000 answers, reached 8 million people, had an extraordinarily high Stack Overflow score, which he has translated into book sales, because people recognize him as an expert in the areas in which he's contributed. Many people use their Stack Overflow scores in their resumes to signal to potential employers how capable they are in particular programming areas. So another area where people do volunteer work, but with different motivations, here's an example of that. It's the Jim Gray search. In 2007, Jim Gray, who is a famous computer scientist who did a lot of work in database stuff, went on a short sailing trip on his yacht and was reported missing. The Coast Guard searched for 4 days using all sorts of assets, but was unable to find him. And so Since Jim Gray was in the computing field, he had a lot of friends in the computing field, and they organized their own peer-based search for him. They were able to get a digital globe satellite to take a scan of the area, generating thousands of photos. These were posted to Amazon Mechanical Turk, and people were asked for free to search through the pictures in the hope of spotting his boat. And over 12,000 volunteers examined more than 560,000 images, covering nearly 35,000 square miles of ocean in 3 weeks. So this was a vast effort. It was ultimately not fruitful. They didn't find him. But the remarkable thing is the amount of effort that was invested. And, you kind of need to ask yourself, like, what drove people to do that? To give another example, which is of similar scale, but different in the story, is the Stardust experiment. With the Stardust experiment, some tiles of porous aerogel were put on the outside of satellites orbiting the Earth, with the idea that interstellar dust grains would at least potentially hit the porous or aerogel and get caught there. And then later on, those tiles were retrieved and brought back to Earth. And then the task became finding the tracks left by these interstellar dust grains. And so at the end of the track, you could find the dust grain and then, examine its composition. So this involved looking at huge numbers of photos for these little tracks. And in this experiment, again, working with volunteers, they got about 30,000 volunteers and who made over 100 million searches. And after all this work, only 7 samples of interstellar dust were found. So this has got to be what I would say perhaps the most boring task in history, and yet huge participation was elicited for it. Like, how could that happen? They get, because they're not getting any personal benefit in this case, they're not learning anything, there's no community connection, there's, they're not getting reputation, certainly not money. And to understand these kinds of engagements, one useful tool is to think about moral foundations theory, which was developed by social psychologists Jonathan Haidt and Jesse Graham, and it tries to categorize what people consider to be valid bases for moral behavior. And the number of foundations varies a little bit from person to person, but one of them is that people are concerned, motivated by caring for people and avoiding harm for them. They're motivated by sanctity, maintaining sanctity and purity. They're motivated by fairness and, not allowing cheating, by loyalty, by respect for authority, by support of liberty. And these moral foundations seem to be very helpful to understand why people participate in a lot of crowd computing engagements. For example, Viswid, which is the tool where people put up pictures of something, blind people put up pictures of something they want to know about, probably is driven, for example, by the CARE Foundation. Helping people with rare diseases through putting information about symptoms and treatments on the Patients Like Me website, probably the same. Contributing to science and medicine, such as the interstellar dust. Actually does not. I'm not sure where that fits, honestly, to tell you the truth. So I'm going to skip over that. Skipping someone's life. Moderators and trolls in social media. You can think that, trolls may believe that they're working in service of avoiding subversion, avoiding cheating. Moderators are working in service of sanctity and purity and care in social media. The effort for uncovering government corruption that was crowdsourced by the UK Guardian could fit into the fairness and cheating moral foundation. There are digital vigilantes online, such as something called the Human Flesh search engine in China, where people who did things that were considered to be unjust are uncovered and, researched and doxxed. There are people in the U.S. who monitor the border as volunteers, from their laptops to see if there's any immigrants, illegal immigrants crossing the border. So these all seem to be driven by different concepts people have of what's the right and moral thing to do, and not because it benefits them directly or pays them or anything like that. Another important motivation is social. For example, if you ask yourself, why do so many people use Facebook for various purposes, which includes, distributing information to others, so, it does have a collective intelligence benefit. Why do so many people do it? Well, basically because their friends are there. So it's a way of connecting with other people. Why do so many people contribute to open source software in addition to the ideas I gave before? People do it probably for companionship and social acceptance. They're participating as part of a team, let's say, developing some open software, they're getting mentoring and so on. So whenever you have a system that relies on socially based motivation, then you run into something called the network effect. The network effect occurs in systems where the value of the system to the users increases based on the number of users. So for example, consider a telephone. If you have just one telephone, it's pretty much useless, right? You can't talk to anybody. If you have two, it's got, some value, but it's very limited. But as you increase the number of people who have telephones and therefore the number of connections that can be made, you'll find that the value of the telephone increases more and more. And in fact, it's typically understood to follow an S-curve, that at first adding users, increases utility, but not that much. And then there's the middle part where you get a more or less exponential growth in the value of the technology based on the number of users. And then eventually you reach saturation and it asymptotes out when basically, everybody or almost everybody has telephones. So if you have several systems which are both trying to achieve the same purpose, let's say what's it called, a microblog like Twitter, aka X, versus the Google Threads, and they both rely on social motivations and therefore are prone to the network effect. Which of these systems will people go and use? Will it, for example, be spread evenly across the competing systems? Or will people migrate to the best system? And it turns out that the right answer is none of those, because there's something called critical mass and the winner takes all effect. Systems that rely on the network effect, which includes any kind of crowd computing system where social interaction is important, they typically have a critical mass barrier to achieving self-sustaining community growth. And, basically what it means is that if, I go to a system where the value comes from the other people who are using it, if there are not enough people there, it looks dead to me and I won't be interested in joining and I'll leave. And other people making the same choice will, probably be motivated to do the same thing, and then the system collapses. The community collapses, the system is not viable. And when this kind of thing happens with multiple competing systems, you get a winner-take-all dynamics. The system that gets to enough people so that other people want to join, the system that gets there first wins all the users, and the system that um, doesn't get there in time before the other system starts ramping up in a viral way, all the other systems just basically die. So you get a curve, something like this, that happened with social networking in the competition between MySpace and Facebook. MySpace actually started earlier, but it wasn't as fast as getting in terms of getting to a critical mass where it had so many users that people were joining just because of how many other users there were. While Facebook, even though it started later, had a better marketing scheme, so it crossed the critical mass barrier before MySpace had a chance to. And at that point, people saw that MySpace was, not growing in terms of the number of users, that everybody they knew was moving to Facebook. So that produced a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, and Facebook took over and MySpace disappeared. But the winner in these kinds of winner-takes-all engagements are not necessarily the best technologies. And there's many examples of systems based on network effects where the best technology lost. It happened, for example, in videotapes. It happened in social media. It happened in operating systems. Why did Windows become the dominant operating system, even though it's technically worse in many metrics compared to Linux, Unix, or derivatives like Mac operating system? So the lessons you can learn from if you want to have a system based on social motivation to get people involved is that you need to reach critical mass as fast as possible so people start joining just because other people are there. One trick that Facebook used is that they started by developing critical mass on a limited community. With Facebook, it was university students. And then once they dominated in that context, then they expanded to others. And another thing that is important to do is to make the system look as actively used as possible so that people should have a lot of visibility to how many other people are using it, so people can, in effect, feel the other people in the virtual room. And what some systems do is that they actually use bots and other tricks in order to give the appearance of lots of social activity in order to bring the system up to critical mass. So let's move to another kind of crowd computing system and another kind of incentive mechanism. So the system I'm talking about first is Foldit, which is a game for doing protein folding. So proteins consist of these long chains of amino acids, and in solution, they automatically kind of collapse into the lowest energy shape, and that shape determines what their function is, what they will do. And so, if a biologist wants to understand what a protein does, first they'll find out the sequence of amino acids, but then they need to figure out what shape it produces. And then based on the shape, they can begin figuring out what it does. And normally this is done by supercomputers and simulations, but since it's such an enormously, computationally difficult problem, there's been many proteins that they've been unable to figure out, especially at the time when the system was being developed. And so instead, a game was created where people competed to take a chain of amino acids and then to shape it into lowest energy shape. And a simulator provided by the game told people how much energy their chosen shape had. And then different players could look at all the competing shapes, look at the ones that have the best scores, which means the lowest energy configuration, and try to improve on them by changing them so that the shape has an even lower energy and therefore is more, likely to be the correct one. Because, in natural systems, a system will always go to the lowest energy configuration eventually. And they discovered using this system protein structures for proteins that supercomputers at that time weren't able to. And this, for example, led to a famous Nature article on Foldit. And so you had, people putting an enormous amount of effort on protein folding. Another example, also in the citizen science domain, is called iWire, which is a game from a lab at Princeton. And the task there is that the lab was trying to develop 3D maps of the neurons in the retina of an eye. And the procedure for doing that is freezing the retina and then taking thousands of tiny, tiny slices and taking a photo of each slice. And then the task is to connect the slice images in order to create a model of the neurons that are passing through the slices. Yeah. And, oops. So, the question in this case is, what motivates people to work on these kinds of citizen science problems? And clearly there's many, people no doubt are interested in contributing something meaningful. But, part of the trick is gamification, where you could take, boring unpaid tasks and turn them into games that people want to play. And there's lots of tricks for taking tasks and making them gamified. There's a book, for example, that has quite a substantial listing of this called Actual Gamification by Yu Kai Cho that you could look at. And then the last category of ways to engage crowd members is Google search, which we described before. And Google search is based on PageRank, which works by counting the number and intensity of the hot links that people put between pages on the web. So these links are created by people, and they're done, it's done for free. And, it's based on the assumption that, the pages that get more links to them added by people are more likely to be important and therefore worthy of being higher ranked. So this is what the PageRank algorithm is based on. So Google search results are based on the human collective effort of creating hyperlinks. Another example is Google Flu Trends, where Google found it was able to produce a stunningly accurate model of the amount of a flu going on in the United States just by looking at the number of queries made to Google about flus. And so again, people were not, intentionally doing the work, but they were producing a very valuable result as a side effect of their regular activity. So this is another trick that is used a lot in crowd computing, where platforms profitably harness the activity that people do anyways, without intentionally trying to do any work. So to summarize, there's a whole constellation of motivations for getting people involved in crowd computing applications. They include a sort of whole branch for motivations that involve some kind of benefit to the user. They could be acquiring skills, acquiring reputation, creating and improving stuff that they use, like open source, making social connections. They could be winning small money for micropayments or significant, a chance at significant money. from contests. They could also be motivated by essentially love, which means doing things that are meaningful to them, that provide them with social contact, that are just fun. And then finally, they can be drawn in simply by taking advantage of the work that they do anyways. So it's kind of like hidden work. So, so that's the list of major motivations for getting people involved in crowd computing. One last point I'd like to cover is the question of crowd activity. So in a crowd computing system, what do you think the distribution of participants would be? Like how many would have what activity level? For example, would everybody have about the same activity level? Would it be random or what? And it turns out that reproducibly in basically almost all the crowd computing systems that I've been exposed to, that participation follows what's called a power law. So here, for example, is the distribution of contributors to the Reddit forum, where you can see that there's a small number of people who produce an enormous amount of contributions, and then which quickly drops off in a kind of exponential way to where you have lots of people who each do small amounts. Here's an example in terms of Wikipedia authors, where again you have a small number of authors, maybe just a few percent, 5% of them who do the bulk of the work. So this is just a standard pattern for crowd computing tools. And the question is, why is crowd participation basically always governed by this kind of power law? Incidentally, it's called the power law because the shape can be described by calculating e to the negative power of how active the person is. The number of people involved is e to the negative power of how active they are. And in general, power laws occur in natural system when participation creates a positive feedback loop. In other words, when participating in a system more increases your incentive to participate. So, this probably is at least part of what happens in crowd computing systems. And basically, people who contribute enough to experience the benefits of higher participation, getting, substantial social connection, reputation, meaning, or fun, are likely to want to continue or even increase their activity. So it becomes kind of positive feedback loop. And why does this matter? Why is it important to know that the power law participation curves applies? It means that we have a large number of low activity participants, whom are often called lurkers, and then a small number of super users that do the bulk of the work. So if you're trying to have an effective crowd computing system, you have two challenges. One is to try to upgrade your lurkers to turn them into super users. And so, the various tricks to try to give them, like little prizes to help break them out of doing small amounts of activity. Your second challenge is to keep your super users, that 5 or 10% of your crowd, because they're the ones who are doing 80 or 90% of the work.